She was running. Not from a person, not from a city, from a life that had finally decided she was expendable. The rain erased the road behind her as if the world itself was deleting evidence of where she had been. The speedometer crept higher than it should. The fuel gauge dropped lower than she allowed herself to notice. The phone lay dark on the passenger seat because there was no one left to call and nothing left to explain. Whatever had broken her was no longer behind her. It was close, patient, and inevitable. She did not drive toward safety. She drove toward disappearance. For the first 90 seconds of her story, there was no town, no destination, no future, only motion, only pressure, only the terrifying clarity that if she stopped, whatever had been slowly killing her would finally reach her. This was not escape as hope. This was escape as last function. Then the lights appeared. A thin, trembling line of yellow in the rain, a place too small to be on any map that mattered. A town that did not announce itself, did not promise shelter, did not pretend to be kind. Forest pressed against its edges. Water swallowed the horizon behind it. Silence waited inside it like something alive. She did not arrive there. She collapsed into it. And somewhere inside that quiet, something noticed her. The rain had already erased the road behind her before the city appeared. It did not begin with arrival. It began with flight. The night was narrow and loud, the windshield a moving wall of water, the headlights cutting a fragile tunnel through darkness that seemed determined to swallow it whole. Her hands had remained locked on the steering wheel long after her shoulders began to ache, long after her breathing grew shallow, long after the idea of turning back disappeared. The road did not feel like a path toward something. It felt like the last remaining distance between her and whatever had finally decided to follow her. She did not come to this town. She escaped into it. For the first 90 seconds of her story, there was only motion, pressure, and the unspoken certainty that stopping was not an option. The gas gauge hovered lower than comfort allowed. The wipers dragged in exhausted arcs. The radio remained off, because silence was the only thing that could not lie to her. Every mile behind her had been paid for in something she could not recover. Every mile ahead promised nothing except the fragile possibility of being unseen. The town emerged without ceremony. A thin band of yellow light cut through the rain, then another, then a crooked row of storefronts pressed close to the road as if they had grown there by accident. No welcoming signs, no visible landmarks. Just water, darkness, and buildings that seemed to watch rather than announce themselves. Forest crowded the edges, heavy and wet, its black mass swallowing everything beyond the last street lamp. A wide body of water lay somewhere behind the buildings, invisible but present, the air thick with its metallic smell. She drove past the center once, too fast, not trusting the first impression of safety. Then she turned back, the tires whispering across soaked asphalt, and slowed until the town revealed its shape. A single main road, a gas station that appeared closed but for one dim interior light, a diner with fogged windows and no cars outside. A few houses set back behind trees, their porch lights casting narrow cones of warmth that did not reach the road. Everything was small. Everything was close. There was nowhere to disappear here. That was the first warning. She parked where the street widened near the edge of the water and sat in the quiet that followed the engine's death. The rain softened to a persistent hiss, tapping against the roof, the hood, the glass. Her reflection in the windshield looked like someone else's face, pale and drawn, eyes too sharp for exhaustion alone. She did not allow herself to cry. She had learned, over years that did not feel like hers anymore, that tears were a currency too easily spent. This place did not promise forgiveness. It promised pause. That was enough. She stepped out into the cold and was immediately wrapped in the smell of wet leaves, iron, and something faintly brackish drifting up from the water. Her jacket was too thin for the night, but she did not notice the chill until much later. The town did not move around her. No doors opened. No voices cut through the rain. The quiet felt deliberate, as if the place had decided to wait before acknowledging her existence. She carried one bag. It held less than the life she had left behind, and more than she was willing to explain. A change of clothes, a worn notebook, documents folded so many times they had become soft at the edges, a phone with no notifications and too many numbers she had memorized but would never call again. She did not bring photographs. She did not bring anything that could remind her of the version of herself that had broken somewhere else. The air tasted of water and rust. It felt like standing on the threshold of a place that did not pretend to be gentle. She did not know the town's name yet. She did not ask. Names had power, and she had spent too long letting other people define what things were called. She began walking, following the sidewalk toward the cluster of lights that marked the center. The buildings were close enough that she could see into windows, but not close enough to read lives. A bar with its sign dark. A small hardware store with a single bulb burning over the register. A narrow motel with a vacancy sign that flickered, the red letters struggling against the rain. She had not planned to stay anywhere. Planning implied permanence. Permanence had become dangerous. As she crossed the street toward the motel, a presence entered the frame of her awareness without announcing itself. No sound, no words, just the sensation of being measured. He stood under the overhang of a closed storefront, the rain barely touching him. Not tall in a way that demanded attention, not imposing in the way of men who wanted to be seen as threats. His strength was quieter, more contained. Broad shoulders beneath a dark jacket, stillness that suggested control rather than caution. His face was partly shadowed by the dim light behind him, but his eyes were clear enough for her to feel them on her. She did not stop. She did not quicken her pace. Her body recognized the situation before her mind allowed it to form into thought. This was not a passerby. This was not curiosity. This was awareness. Their paths crossed at the edge of the motel parking lot. For a fraction of a second, they occupied the same narrow space between rain and light. She saw that he was older than her by enough years to matter, though not so many that time had softened him. There was no surprise in his expression, no interest that could be mistaken for flirtation, only the focused attention of someone who had spent a long time learning how to read what did not want to be read. He did not ask her name. He did not ask where she was from. He did not ask why a woman arrived alone in the middle of a storm with a single bag and eyes that did not belong to someone on vacation. He simply watched her. The moment did not stretch into anything dramatic. No raised voices, no visible threat. But the tension in the air between them was immediate and unmistakable, like the first tightening of wire before it snapped. She passed him, aware of the exact distance between their bodies, aware that he could have stopped her without effort and did not. Inside the motel office, the clerk barely looked up. The transaction was efficient, almost impersonal. Cash slid across the counter. A key changed hands. A single sentence about checkout time. The kind of exchange that did not require names. She did not realize until later how carefully the clerk avoided meeting her eyes. Her room smelled faintly of detergent and old wood. The window faced the water, though the rain blurred everything beyond the glass into a smear of darkness and reflected light. She dropped her bag on the floor, locked the door, and leaned her forehead against the cool surface for several long seconds, listening to her own breathing. This was where everything had broken. Not the night itself, not the road, not even the moment she saw him outside. The breaking had happened earlier, somewhere she had left behind, somewhere that no longer allowed her to exist as anything but a role. But this was the place where she finally stopped running forward and allowed the damage to surface. She slid down the door until she was sitting on the floor, her back against the thin wood, her knees drawn up. The silence inside the room was heavier than the rain outside. For the first time in days, she was not moving. The absence of motion was almost unbearable. She did not think about what she had lost. She did not think about what she had survived. She thought only about the fact that she was still here, in a room that did not belong to anyone who knew her, in a town that had not yet decided what she was allowed to be. When she finally stood, it was not with relief. It was with a careful, deliberate control she had learned in other rooms, in other nights, under other kinds of scrutiny. She went to the sink, splashed water on her face, studied the woman in the mirror as if assessing a stranger. There were no visible marks, no bruises, no proof of anything that had driven her here, only the faint tension around the mouth, the eyes that did not rest easily in their sockets. She changed into dry clothes and sat on the edge of the bed, the mattress dipping under her weight. The town outside remained quiet. No sirens, no laughter, no indication that anything beyond her own arrival had disturbed its routine. But she did not feel alone. She felt observed. Not in the way that triggers fear, in the way that suggests a system noticing an irregularity. The man outside had not followed her. She was certain of that. And yet, she could not shake the sense that her presence had already been recorded somewhere that did not use paper or screens. The town did not strike her as naive. It felt contained, organized in ways that did not announce themselves. She lay back and stared at the ceiling, tracing the faint cracks in the paint. The sound of the rain softened. Time moved without her participation. Her mind tried to return to what she had left behind, to the work that had consumed her, to the people who had known her by functions rather than by name, to the version of herself that had learned how to endure without demanding anything in return. She pushed the memories away not because they were painful, but because they were dangerous. Pain could be survived. Patterns were harder to escape. She did not know how long she lay there before sleep finally took her. When it did, it was not gentle. Dreams came in fragments, sharp and disordered. Corridors without exits. Doors that opened into rooms she did not remember entering. The feeling of being watched not with hunger, but with calculation. She woke before dawn, the gray light seeping through the thin curtains. The rain had stopped. The world outside looked rinsed, stripped of color, as if the night had washed something away. She dressed and stepped outside. The air was cold and clean, the smell of wet earth stronger now without the noise of rain. The water beyond the buildings lay still, a flat sheet of dull silver. Mist clung to its surface, blurring the far shore into nothing. She walked without direction, letting the town reveal itself in the quiet of early morning. A bakery opening its doors, the scent of bread cutting through the damp air. A lone truck parked near the pier. The same bar from the night before, still dark, its windows reflecting the pale sky. She reached the edge of the water and stood there, her hands tucked into her jacket, watching the mist move. For the first time since she had left, her body began to relax in ways she had not allowed. The tension did not disappear, but it loosened, like a fist that had been clenched too long. She did not hear him approach. She sensed him before she saw him, the same awareness that had marked their first encounter. He stopped a few feet away, far enough to respect space, close enough to make his presence unmistakable. In the morning light, his features were clearer, lines at the edges of his eyes that spoke of age rather than fatigue, a stillness that did not belong to someone who drifted through places without purpose. He looked at the water, not at her. He did not speak. The silence between them did not feel accidental. She did not turn toward him. She did not offer explanation. The moment did not require either. In the absence of words, the tension deepened. Not romantic, not hostile, something more precise. A recognition of two people who did not arrive at places without reasons they were not ready to share. She felt with a clarity that startled her that whatever this town was, whatever structure lay beneath its quiet surface, he was part of it. Not as a figurehead, not as a symbol, as an element that made it function. She also felt that her presence here was not neutral. When she finally turned to look at him, he met her gaze without hesitation. There was no curiosity in his eyes, no judgment, only a steady assessment that did not soften when it found what it was looking for. In that instant, the story declared its terms. She was not invisible here. She was not anonymous. The past she had brought with her had not been left at the edge of the road. It had entered the town with her, carrying consequences she did not yet understand. He did not ask her anything. He did not offer help. He did not warn her away. But in the stillness of that early morning, with the water silent behind them and the town holding its breath, something fundamental shifted. This was not a place to hide. This was a place where everything that was broken would be seen. And whatever had drawn her here had already begun to answer back. She tried to become invisible. Not by hiding, but by dissolving into routine. Mornings began with narrow streets still damp from night, storefronts opening like cautious eyes, the muted ritual of a place that had never learned how to perform for strangers. She moved through it without hurry, without purpose that anyone could read. Small shops offered necessities without questions. The cafe near the waterfront remembered her order without ever asking her name. Faces appeared, measured her presence, then decided whether she belonged. There was no polite neutrality here. People either accepted or rejected, and both judgments were quiet, final, and unmistakable. The town did not pretend to be gentle. It did not flatter her with charm. It did not soften its edges for newcomers. It existed the way weather existed, and like weather, it did not care whether she was prepared. That was what unsettled her most. In places she had known before, there had always been masks, professional ones, social ones, strategic ones. Here there were none. What people were, they were openly. Kindness was not decorative. Hostility was not disguised. Curiosity was not apologized for. This honesty made it impossible to disappear. She learned quickly that isolation here was a choice, not a default. Every movement was noticed, not with suspicion, but with awareness. A town this small could not afford blindness. When she walked past the marina, men repairing nets glanced up once, then returned to their work, already deciding whether she was a problem or simply passing through. When she entered the grocery store, the woman at the register marked her with a look that was not unkind but absolute, as if cataloging an unfamiliar object. When she sat on the low stone wall near the forest edge, a pair of children paused their game long enough to memorize her face before vanishing back into the trees. She was not used to being seen this way. In her former life, visibility had meant exposure, risk, consequence. Here, it meant something else. Here, being seen did not equal being hunted, yet the sensation unsettled her because it stripped away the anonymity she had counted on. She had come to hide. The town did not allow hiding. She attempted to anchor herself in the small mechanics of daily life. She unpacked slowly, arranging her few belongings in the rented room as if order could substitute for stability. She ran along the perimeter of the lake at dawn, the cold mist cutting her lungs, her body reminding her that it still existed independently of memory. She read in the evenings, not for pleasure but for occupation, letting words fill the spaces where thought might otherwise drift back to what she had left behind. She spoke to no one unless spoken to. She smiled when required. She did not share stories. The town did not demand them. But it did not ignore her either. It was during one of her early walks, when the light had not yet committed to morning and the air still carried the metallic scent of water, that she noticed the man again. He did not approach. He did not signal. He simply occupied the same space with a precision that suggested intention rather than coincidence. She had seen him the night she arrived, when rain had blurred the world into streaks of light and shadow. Then he had been a presence at the edge of vision. Now he was unmistakable. He stood near the dock where private boats were moored, hands in the pockets of a dark coat that looked too controlled for the setting. He did not dress like the fishermen or the mechanics or the men who carried the physical labor of the town on their backs. His stillness was not passive. It was the stillness of someone who did not need to prove anything. He did not look at her immediately. He watched the water as if reading something in its surface. When his gaze finally shifted, it did not search. It assessed. There was no hunger in it, no curiosity that reached forward, only recognition. She did not know why the moment unsettled her. They did not speak. They did not acknowledge each other. Yet something in the geometry of the encounter suggested a line being drawn. Not attraction, not threat, awareness. Later, she would understand that this was how he saw the world. Not in stories or emotions, but in patterns, in vulnerabilities, in what could break and what would endure. She began to notice him everywhere after that. Not in the way one notices a stranger, but in the way one becomes aware of a constant in an environment. He appeared near the municipal building in the late afternoon, standing in conversation with men who carried authority not through rank, but through reputation. He appeared near the edge of the industrial road that led out of town, where the warehouses and storage facilities sat like mute witnesses to transactions no one advertised. He appeared once outside the clinic, speaking with the director in a manner that suggested familiarity rather than formality. Each time, he did not seek her. Yet each time, his presence intersected with hers as if by design. She did not ask about him. Questions had a way of revealing more about the person asking than the one being asked. But she listened. This town did not gossip in the conventional sense. There were no exaggerated narratives, no idle cruelty. Information traveled differently here, through implication, through absence, through the way certain names were never spoken and certain buildings were never pointed out. The man's name did not appear in conversation, yet his influence surfaced in the spaces between words. When a local business closed suddenly without explanation, it was understood that the decision had not been accidental. When a dispute over land resolved itself overnight, no one expressed surprise. When outsiders passed through and never returned, no one wondered where they had gone. Power did not announce itself here. It simply functioned. She realized, slowly, that he was part of that function. Not an official, not a figurehead, something more subtle and more dangerous. He belonged to the infrastructure of the town, to the mechanisms that kept problems from becoming visible. Where others reacted, he intervened. Where others argued, he redirected. Where others feared consequences, he calculated them. She should have avoided him. Every instinct she had refined through years of survival told her that men like him did not offer safety. They offered structure, and structure always demanded something in return. Yet the paradox of his presence was that when he was near, the air felt less unstable. Not gentler, but contained, as if the world had edges again. They began to cross paths more deliberately. Once in the narrow aisle of the hardware store, where shelves pressed too close and the smell of metal and oil clung to everything. He had been there before her, selecting items with mechanical precision. She had felt the shift in the space before she saw him, the way one senses a change in pressure. He stepped aside without ceremony, not out of politeness but out of efficiency. His eyes met hers briefly, long enough for something unspoken to register. Not interest, recognition again. Another time, near the forest road that curved away from town, where cell service died and the trees swallowed sound. She had taken the path out of impulse, driven by a need for distance that had nothing to do with geography. He had been there already, leaning against a vehicle that did not belong to the locals. It was too clean, too deliberate in its anonymity. He did not ask why she was there. He did not suggest she turn back. But the way his gaze followed her movement, not as a man watches a woman, but as one calculates risk, made her aware that even solitude here was not unobserved. She did not fear him. That was what unsettled her. Fear was familiar. It was predictable. It told her when to run. What she felt instead was something more dangerous, a measured trust she had not chosen, forming in the absence of promises. He did not offer protection. He did not present himself as a solution. Yet in his presence, the chaos that lived just beneath her skin seemed a quieter. At the same time, the past did not release its grip. It did not announce itself dramatically. It arrived in fragments, A missed call that left no voicemail. A car parked too long on a side street. Footsteps behind her that stopped when she turned. Once, the faint click of a camera shutter from a distance she could not locate. None of it was proof. All of it was pattern. She did not speak of it. Speaking would have made it real. But he noticed. Not the events themselves, but the way her body responded to them. The sudden stillness when she sensed movement behind her. The way her eyes tracked exits in every room. The tension in her shoulders that did not belong to someone simply adjusting to a new environment. He did not ask what she was hiding from. He did not ask who had followed her here. He simply adjusted the environment around her in small, almost invisible ways. The door to the building where she stayed was repaired one afternoon without her requesting it, the faulty lock replaced with something heavier, quieter. The streetlight near the end of her block, which had flickered unpredictably since her arrival, began to function consistently. A man who had lingered too often outside the cafe when she was there stopped appearing. None of this was dramatic. None of it was announced. But she noticed. She understood then that his strength was not expressive. It did not manifest in displays or declarations. It existed in systems, in anticipation, in the kind of control that prevented threats from becoming visible enough to be acknowledged. This did not make him safe. It made him dangerous in a different way. Because dependence did not begin with need, it began with relief. She told herself she was not relying on him, that the changes were coincidence, that the calm she felt in his proximity was psychological, a projection of her own exhaustion. But she could not deny the pattern. Where he existed, danger receded, not eliminated, managed. The town, which had initially felt like neutral ground, revealed itself to be something else entirely. It was not an escape. It was a structure, one that tolerated only what it could contain. She had arrived believing she could disappear into it. Instead, she had been absorbed. And at the center of that absorption was him. She did not yet know his history. She did not know what he had built or what he had destroyed to secure the quiet authority he carried. But she began to understand the unspoken rule of this place. Nothing happened here without passing through certain hands. His hands. Her past continued to press against the edges of the present. She could feel it testing the perimeter, searching for weaknesses. The town did not offer anonymity, but it did offer something else, containment. And he was the mechanism by which containment was enforced. This realization did not comfort her. It intrigued her. Because if he was capable of controlling the space around her, then he was also capable of defining what happened within it. And she, who had fled a world that had claimed the right to define her, now found herself standing inside another system of power, quieter but no less absolute. The difference was that this one did not pretend to be moral. It did not speak of justice or salvation. It functioned. It solved. It erased problems before they required narrative. And for the first time since she had begun running, someone saw the danger following her not as tragedy, not as something to mourn or dramatize, but as a variable. A problem to be handled. She did not yet understand what that would cost. But she understood something else, something far more dangerous than fear. If she stayed here, she would not remain invisible. She would be claimed by the structure that ruled this town. And the man at its center had already noticed her. She began to trust him, not because he promised protection, but because he never did. There were no declarations, no reassurances, no gestures designed to soothe. What he offered instead was something colder and more reliable, action stripped of spectacle. When a vehicle lingered too long near her street, it did not return. When unfamiliar faces appeared in places they did not belong, they were redirected without confrontation. When information about her movements began to circulate in ways that felt wrong, the circulation stopped. He did not explain what he was doing. He simply adjusted the world around her until threat lost its shape. She learned to read these changes the way one learns to read weather. Subtle pressure shifts, a tightening of space, the quiet removal of variables that might have become dangerous if left unattended. It was not comfort he provided, it was structure. And after years of living inside chaos, structure felt dangerously close to relief. Their connection did not form in touch or in the language of romance. It formed in decisions, in routes chosen and avoided, in the timing of movement, in shared glances that replaced questions neither of them wanted answered aloud. She rode beside him during night drives through roads that dissolved into forest, the town receding into something abstract behind them. He drove without urgency, without music, without unnecessary words. The world outside the windshield became a corridor of shadow and light, and inside that corridor, something between them aligned. She did not tell him everything. She told him enough. Fragments of a life built inside systems that had promised order and delivered erasure. A history of being managed, processed, and discarded once she no longer fit the framework that had defined her. The experience of understanding, too late, that compliance did not equal safety, that institutions did not protect what could be written off as inconvenient. She did not name names. She did not provide timelines. She spoke in contours, not details. But the shape of what had happened was unmistakable. He did not interrupt. He did not press for clarity. He absorbed what she gave him the way he absorbed everything, as data, as risk, as context for decisions he would later make without asking permission. In return, he showed her the world he operated within. Not the surface version of it, not the sanitized idea of authority or the visible symbols of control. He showed her the mechanics, how influence was built through networks rather than titles, how stability was maintained not by laws, but by agreements that never appeared in writing, how violence was rarely necessary when fear could be administered precisely, how problems were not solved publicly, but removed quietly, so that the environment never had to acknowledge their existence. Power in his world was not a posture. It was a responsibility that could not be refused once assumed. Every decision altered the shape of the space around it. Every intervention created consequences that demanded further intervention. There was no purity in it, only function. She understood then why his presence felt the way it did. He did not protect because he cared in the conventional sense. He protected because once something entered his sphere, it became part of the structure he was obligated to maintain. And she, without asking, had crossed into that sphere. This realization should have terrified her. Instead, it grounded her. For the first time since she had begun running, she was no longer the only one calculating risk. Someone else was mapping the terrain, anticipating impact, managing variables she had neither the resources nor the reach to control alone. He did not ask her to surrender agency. He did not demand loyalty. He simply acted as if her safety were a factor that had already been integrated into his system. They existed beside one another, in a space defined by restraint. There were moments when proximity threatened to become something else, when the quiet between them sharpened into awareness, when her body responded before her mind had time to reassert its defenses. But neither of them crossed that threshold, not because they lacked desire, but because both of them understood what crossing it would cost. For him, intimacy was not a private act. It was a disruption. Any emotional attachment became a vulnerability that could be exploited by those who measured weakness the way others measured profit. For her, closeness had always been followed by control, by obligation, by a slow erosion of autonomy disguised as care. They were both fluent in the language of consequences. Yet the tension between them did not diminish. It intensified precisely because it remained contained. They began to operate as a unit. Not publicly, not officially, but in ways that mattered. She consulted him before making decisions that involved movement beyond the town. He adjusted resources in anticipation of needs she had not yet voiced. They coordinated without instruction, reading patterns in the environment the way others read faces. Where she saw danger, he saw logistics. Where he saw risk, she saw human cost. Together, they covered the blind spots in each other's perception. She noticed how the town responded to their alignment. Not with curiosity, but with a quiet recalibration. People did not approach them as a pair, but they adjusted their behavior around her in ways they had not before. The subtle assessments that had once measured her as an unknown shifted into something closer to acknowledgement. She was no longer simply the outsider who had arrived in the rain. She was now something else, someone inside the structure rather than at its edges. This was not acceptance. It was recognition of position. And position, in a place like this, was never neutral. The past continued to press inward. Not in ways that could be proven, but in patterns that could not be ignored. A delivery misrouted. A record accessed without authorization. A message that appeared on a device she had never given to anyone. Each incident was small enough to be dismissed individually. Together, they formed a trajectory. Someone was testing the perimeter. Someone was measuring the limits of the space she now occupied. She felt the shift before it became overt. The way the air tightened when she moved through certain areas. The way her reflection in windows seemed watched rather than merely visible. The way old instincts, honed in environments where survival required constant vigilance, began to reactivate. She did not ask him if he saw it too. She did not need to. His movements changed, routes were altered, schedules compressed. Certain locations were removed from her daily patterns without explanation. The system around her grew more efficient, more controlled. He was not preparing for confrontation. He was preparing for containment. It was during one of their late drives, the forest closing around the road in a tunnel of shadow, that the boundary between them began to thin. There was no single moment of decision, no dramatic shift, only the cumulative weight of what they had become to one another. Trust built not through confession, but through function. Dependence that did not ask permission. A recognition that each of them had begun to calculate the future with the other already embedded in it. She understood what this meant. To be part of his world was not to be protected. It was to be implicated. Every action he took in her name bound her more tightly to the structure he commanded. Every problem he removed for her created an invisible debt, not in money or obedience, but in shared consequence. If his world fractured, she would be inside the fracture. He understood what it meant as well. She was not merely someone passing through his territory. She was becoming a point of leverage, not because she was weak, but because she mattered. And in his world, anything that mattered could be used. This was the line neither of them could ignore. They stood on opposite sides of it for as long as they could. Until the night it became impossible to maintain distance. The threat that had been circling finally condensed into something tangible. Not an attack, not yet, but a presence that crossed from abstraction into proximity. A vehicle that followed too closely. A shadow that moved when it should not have moved. A message delivered in a way that made it clear she was no longer merely observed, but targeted. He responded the way he always did, without hesitation, without emotion, without drama. The situation was neutralized before it could become visible. She did not see the mechanisms at work. She only felt the aftermath, the way the environment snapped back into controlled stillness. But something had shifted. For the first time, she saw not only his capacity to protect, but the cost of that protection. The way he absorbed conflict into himself. The way he carried responsibility as if it were a permanent condition rather than a choice. The way violence, even when unseen, left traces in posture, in silence, in the precision of his movements afterward. She realized then that what he offered was not safety. It was survival at the expense of everything else. And she understood that if she remained within his sphere, she would be choosing that model of existence. A life defined not by what she wanted, but by what had to be managed. A future in which intimacy could never be innocent because it would always be entangled with power. The realization did not drive her away. It drew her closer. Not in body, not yet, but in alignment, in acceptance of what they were becoming to each other. Two people shaped by systems that did not forgive weakness, finding in each other not escape, but recognition. They did not touch that night. They did not speak of what had nearly happened, of what hovered between them like a held breath. But when she stepped out of the vehicle and turned back, when their eyes met in the darkness, the boundary they had maintained for so long was no longer intact. They had crossed it without movement. From that moment forward, there was no version of their connection that remained neutral. They were no longer merely allies. They were no longer simply two individuals sharing a dangerous geography. They had chosen one another, not in the language of romance, but in the language of consequence. And both of them understood what that choice meant. It would dismantle the order he had built. It would pull her further into a world she had never intended to enter. It would expose the most vulnerable parts of both of them to forces neither could fully control. But they also understood something else, something far more dangerous than fear. Walking away now would not restore what had existed before. The line had been crossed, and there was no safe way back. The past did not return as rumor. It arrived as action. Not in whispers, not in anonymous signals meant to unsettle, but in events that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence or pattern. The first rupture came without spectacle, a break-in that left nothing stolen and everything disturbed, drawers opened and closed with precision, surfaces touched only enough to confirm access. The second followed days later, when a routine movement through town was interrupted by a presence that did not belong, a man who watched her not with curiosity, but with recognition. The third was unmistakable, a message delivered through channels she had not known still existed, written in a language only someone from her former life would use. The abstraction of threat collapsed into form. What had once circled now entered the space directly. She did not tell anyone. She did not need to. He saw it in the way her body tightened before her mind could construct a narrative, in the way she paused at thresholds, in the way her eyes measured distance rather than beauty. The environment around her changed again, but this time the adjustments were not subtle. The system he commanded no longer merely contained risk. It prepared for confrontation. For the first time since she had arrived, she was allowed to glimpse the scale of what stood behind his silence. Not through explanation, but through exposure. Resources appeared that did not belong to a town this size. Vehicles that moved without identifying markers. Men whose presence altered the geometry of space without raising voices. Networks that operated beneath the visible economy of the place, touching logistics, finance, communication, and law with a reach that made local authority irrelevant. The town's quiet was revealed not as innocence, but as the surface of a structure that had learned how to survive by never becoming visible enough to challenge. She understood then that his power was not accidental. It had been built. Not through ambition in the conventional sense, but through accumulation of obligation. He had become indispensable to systems that required discretion more than legitimacy, where the state could not operate without consequence, where institutions hesitated, where legality fractured into ambiguity. He had filled the vacuum, not as a tyrant, but as a solution. And she, who had once been broken by a system that erased people without acknowledging their humanity, now found herself standing beside another system, colder and more efficient, but no less absolute. This realization was not theoretical. It was moral. Every protective measure he enacted on her behalf was rooted in mechanisms that mirrored the forces she had fled. Surveillance, control of information, preemptive intervention, The same tools that had once been used to dismantle her life were now being deployed to shield it. The contradiction cut through her with a precision more painful than fear. Their proximity, which had once felt like alignment, became charged with ethical tension. She began to see the cost of what he offered. Not in money or favors, but in human consequence. In the way certain people disappeared from the periphery of her world, not through violence, but through redirection so complete it might as well have been erasure. In the way systems adjusted to prioritize her safety, not by eliminating harm, but by displacing it elsewhere. In the way the invisible weight of his decisions pressed outward, altering lives she would never witness. She did not confront him, not because she lacked the courage, but because she understood that confrontation would not change the architecture of what he was. He did not operate within moral binaries. He operated within necessity. In his world, harm was not a question of whether, but of where. Yet intimacy between them continued to deepen. Not in gestures, not in confessions, but in shared endurance. They moved through the days as if maintaining a perimeter. Every interaction carried awareness of what could be taken from them if the structure around them failed. The space between them was no longer neutral. It was occupied by something fragile, something neither of them had ever learned how to protect without destroying. The town began to notice. Not in overt accusation, but in the recalibration of perception. She was no longer merely the woman who had arrived in the rain. She was now associated with him, and association, in a place governed by unspoken hierarchies, was never invisible. People did not withdraw, but they adjusted. Conversations ended when she approached. Certain invitations ceased. Certain routes opened that had previously been closed. She felt the shift not as exclusion, but as recognition of her new position within the order of things. Visibility, once imposed, now became a liability. The threat that had followed her into the town responded to this change with escalation. What had begun as observation became intrusion. What had been testing became confrontation. The people who had once operated from a distance began to move openly, confident that anonymity had been replaced by inevitability. They no longer cared whether she knew she was being hunted. They wanted her to understand that the past was not something she could outrun simply by changing geography. The collision came without warning. Not in a public space, not in a moment designed for spectacle, but in a place where she had believed herself briefly alone. The violence was not theatrical. It was efficient, purposeful, stripped of any need to communicate dominance. It existed only to reclaim what had escaped. He arrived not as rescuer, but as interruption. The intervention was not framed as heroism. It was abrupt, decisive, devoid of hesitation. The men who had come for her did not leave the way they had entered. The confrontation did not last long enough to be described in conventional terms. It was not a fight. It was a neutralization. She did not remember the sequence of events. She remembered sensation. The weight of the ground beneath her, the sharp intrusion of pain that did not register as injury until later, the metallic taste at the back of her throat, the sound of breath, not her own, cut short in a way that felt final, and above all, his presence between her and what would have ended her. When the world regained coherence, the cost of that intervention became visible. Not only in the physical aftermath, though there was enough of that to leave its mark. Bruises that bloomed with time, a fracture that would heal but never fully disappear, blood that did not belong to her on her hands before she realized it was there, but also in the invisible consequences that followed. The town did not speak of what had happened. It absorbed it. But absorption did not mean absence of impact. Questions were asked in rooms she would never enter. Lines were drawn that had not existed before. Alliances shifted. The structure that had once functioned invisibly now bore the strain of exposure. His role, which had relied on discretion, was no longer entirely hidden. She saw it in the way people looked at him. Not with fear, not with admiration, but with something closer to acknowledgement of power that had been confirmed through action. The myth of his control had become fact, and fact, once established, demanded response. Their connection was no longer a private alignment. It was now a liability. For her, because her presence had become the catalyst for conflict that extended beyond individual safety. For him, because protecting her had required crossing boundaries that could not be uncrossed. He had revealed the extent of his reach, and in doing so, had altered the balance he had spent years maintaining. She understood then what love cost in his world. Not sentiment. Exposure. Vulnerability not of the heart, but of the system. She began to see herself not only as someone he cared for, but as the fracture through which his carefully maintained order might unravel. The weight of that knowledge pressed on her more heavily than the physical pain. She had not intended to become a threat to the structure that had given her something she had not felt in years. Containment. Not freedom, but stability. The intimacy between them did not dissolve. It hardened. There were no illusions left to protect, no narratives of rescue or redemption. What remained was a connection forged in consequence. Two people bound not by fantasy, but by the reality of what they had already lost in choosing each other. She did not thank him. She did not apologize. Neither of those responses belonged to the space they now occupied. Instead, she began to recognize the full meaning of what it was to be seen by him, not as someone to be saved, but as someone worth destabilizing a system for. Not as a symbol, but as a variable that mattered enough to justify risk. This realization was not romantic. It was terrifying, because it meant that love, in this context, was not sanctuary. It was exposure. It was the act of placing something fragile inside a world that consumed weakness. It was the acceptance that protecting what mattered would require becoming something that could no longer be morally uncomplicated. She had once believed that survival meant escape. Now she understood that survival also meant choosing what one was willing to destroy in order to preserve what one could not replace. The city had begun to ask questions. Not publicly, but through the tightening of observation. Authorities whose jurisdiction had once been theoretical now took interest. Business interests that had coexisted without friction began to reassess their alignments. The quiet equilibrium that had defined the place was no longer stable. And at the center of that instability was the fact that he had chosen her. Not in a gesture. In action. In blood. The light she had thought she was moving toward had not revealed safety. It had revealed cost. And she understood, with a clarity that left no room for denial, that whatever remained of their story would be defined not by what they wanted, but by what they were now responsible for. Love had ceased to be a refuge. It had become a debt. One that would be paid not only in pain, but in reputation, in territory. In the future, neither of them had planned to sacrifice. They had crossed the line together. And now the world was recalculating the price. She no longer measured danger by proximity. After the collision that had torn through the fragile order of the town, after the blood and the silence and the unspoken agreements that followed, danger had become something else entirely. It was no longer the presence of those who had hunted her. It was the structure that had risen around her in response. The system that had once offered containment now demanded consequence. Protection had revealed itself as transformation, not of circumstances, but of identity. She understood this with a clarity that did not require reflection. Nothing about her life could return to what it had been before she arrived in this place. Not the anonymity, not the illusion of neutrality, not even the fragile balance she had constructed through restraint. The town no longer saw her as an outsider. It saw her as a variable within its architecture of power. And power, once acknowledged, never forgot. She watched the environment change in the days that followed. Not in dramatic ways, but in patterns that spoke to someone who had lived too long inside systems to mistake movement for coincidence. New faces appeared near places she frequented. Schedules shifted around her. Access opened where it had once been closed, not as generosity, but as recalibration. She had become a factor in decisions that extended far beyond her own survival. This awareness did not frighten her. It hollowed her, because she recognized the shape of what was happening. She had seen it before in other forms, in other structures that had promised safety in exchange for compliance. She had lived inside frameworks that claimed to protect by defining what was permitted to exist. She had learned, at great cost, that once one allowed the system to determine the boundaries of one's life, identity became secondary to function. She refused to let that happen again. At the same time, she could not deny what he had done. Not the act itself, but the choice behind it. He had not hesitated, not for calculation, not for optics, not for consequence. He had placed himself between her and what would have ended her, knowing exactly what it would cost. He had not protected her out of instinct alone. He had done it with full awareness of the structural damage it would cause. He had chosen her over the equilibrium he had spent years maintaining. That knowledge did not soften what came next. It made it unbearable. Because love, in his world, was not tenderness. It was sacrifice of order. It was the willingness to fracture systems that depended on predictability. It was exposure of power to forces that thrived on weakness. By choosing her, he had not simply altered his own trajectory. He had destabilized an entire network that had relied on his discretion. She saw the weight of that destabilization in him. Not in words, because he did not speak of it, but in the way he moved with increased precision, as if every gesture now required additional calculation. In the way his attention never fully left the environment, as if threat had become a constant variable rather than a condition that could be resolved. In the way silence had deepened between them, not with distance, but with gravity. She began to understand that their closeness was no longer merely dangerous. It was corrosive. Not to feeling, but to structure. Every moment she remained within his sphere, the more the system had to bend around her. Every adjustment made for her safety displaced risk elsewhere. Every intervention conducted on her behalf weakened the neutrality that had once allowed his influence to operate without challenge. His world, which had existed through invisibility, was being forced into visibility because of her. She recognized the familiar architecture of dependence beginning to form. Not emotional dependence, which she had long learned to guard against, but systemic dependence. A reality in which her survival would be contingent upon the continued functioning of his power. A life in which safety would no longer belong to her, but to the structure that claimed her as something to be managed. She would not live that way again. The realization did not come as panic. It came as certainty. She could not remain in a world where her existence required someone else to break themselves in order to preserve it. She could not accept a future in which love demanded the erosion of autonomy, not through overt control, but through the subtle absorption of one's life into another's machinery. She had escaped one system that had decided her value in terms of utility. She would not be folded into another, no matter how different it appeared. He sensed the shift before she spoke. Not because she announced it, but because he had always read change in the same way he read threat. Through absence, through hesitation, through the minute deviations in behavior that revealed intention long before it became language. The way she began to move independently again, no longer adjusting her roots to align with his. The way she withdrew from the protective patterns that had grown around her. The way she began to reclaim risk rather than allowing it to be absorbed on her behalf. This did not anger him. It wounded him. Not in the sense of betrayal, but in the deeper sense of recognition. He understood exactly what she was choosing, because it was the choice he himself had never been able to make. He had built his life on control not because he craved dominance, but because he had never known how to exist without shaping the world around him into something survivable. For him, relinquishing that control did not mean freedom. It meant exposure to forces he had spent years learning how to neutralize. She was choosing to step into that exposure. Not recklessly, consciously. The tension between them reached a point where it could no longer be contained by silence. There was no dramatic confrontation, no ultimatum, no exchange of words that would later be remembered as defining. What unfolded instead was the slow, devastating clarity of two people who understood each other too well to pretend the conflict did not exist. She did not accuse him of wrongdoing. She did not frame her choice as moral superiority. She simply acknowledged the truth they had both been avoiding. That if she stayed, she would become an extension of his system. That if he continued to protect her, he would continue to dismantle the very structure that had made him capable of doing so. That their love, if it remained entangled with power, would evolve into something neither of them could respect. She refused to be protected at the cost of her own agency. He realized, with a precision that left no room for denial, that he could not keep her safe without continuing to destroy the world he inhabited. And more devastatingly, he realized that he did not want to keep her safe if it meant turning her into something she had spent her life resisting. This was the choice no amount of influence could resolve. There were problems he could eliminate. There were threats he could neutralize. There were structures he could bend until they aligned with necessity. But there was no leverage that could be applied to this moment. No force that could make love compatible with autonomy without altering one into the other. He had always believed that power could solve anything that emotion could not. This was the first truth it could not rewrite. Their separation did not unfold as abandonment. It unfolded as release. Not because the bond between them had weakened, but because it had become too honest to allow compromise. They did not step away in anger. They did not leave to punish or to protect themselves from pain. They left because to remain would have meant allowing love to become another mechanism of control. She chose not to be safe at any cost. She chose to be herself, even if that meant returning to uncertainty, to vulnerability, to a life without guarantees. He chose to let her go, even though every structure within him resisted that loss. Even though his world had taught him that anything of value must be secured, contained, defended. For the first time, he confronted a reality in which the most meaningful act of strength was restraint. The absence that followed was not empty. It was heavy. She felt it in the sudden quiet of days no longer shaped by his presence. In the return of risk that was no longer being absorbed by someone else's system. In the knowledge that whatever danger remained in the world was now hers to navigate again, without the shield of his influence. He felt it in the way his power ceased to have weight. Not externally because the structure he had built did not collapse overnight, but internally because without her, the purpose that had briefly transcended function dissolved. Control returned to its familiar shape, but it no longer carried meaning. Authority remained, but it no longer satisfied. The world he commanded became once again what it had always been, efficient, stable, and hollow. Their connection did not end. It transformed into something neither of them could inhabit directly. They carried each other forward not as possession, not as obligation, but as reference, as the point against which future choices would be measured. She did not forget what it had meant to be seen without being owned. He did not forget what it had meant to choose something beyond structure, even if only once. This was the most painful moment of their story. Not because they lost each other, but because they released each other with full understanding of what they were giving up. There was no illusion of eventual reunion. No promise that time would reconcile what power could not. Only the knowledge that love, in its most honest form, had required them to prioritize integrity over possession. She walked back into a world that did not guarantee her safety. He remained in a world that no longer guaranteed him meaning. And both of them knew that if they had chosen differently, if they had clung to one another in the language of dependency, love would have survived in form but died in essence. They did not allow that to happen. They chose truth. And in doing so, they accepted the most devastating reality either of them had ever faced. That sometimes, the deepest act of love is not holding on. It is letting go without pretending it does not hurt. Time did not soften what had been broken. It reshaped it. What remained after their separation was not absence, but a different kind of presence that followed them into the lives they rebuilt. The world did not pause for their choices. Cities continued to move, systems continued to operate, violence continued to exist where it always had. But something within both of them had shifted beyond reversal. She stopped thinking of herself as someone in flight. Not because danger had vanished, but because she no longer organized her life around escape. The places she inhabited were no longer temporary shelters. They were chosen spaces, defined not by how quickly she could leave them, but by how deliberately she entered them. She carried her past without denying it, without narrating it as tragedy or triumph. It existed as a fact of her body, her reflexes, her instincts. It no longer dictated her future, but it shaped the way she moved through it. Her days became quieter, in ways she had not known how to imagine before. Not empty. Intentional. She built routines that were not reactions, work that did not exist solely to keep her hidden, relationships that were not structured around the management of threat. She learned the difference between vigilance and fear, between caution and submission. The world still contained risk, but it no longer defined her identity. She was no longer surviving. She was choosing. There were moments when she felt the echo of what had once protected her. Not as longing, but as memory of a kind of safety she had known only once. She did not romanticize it. She understood now what it had cost him, what it had cost her, what it would have required them to become if they had remained within that structure. The clarity of that understanding did not erase the ache, but it gave it shape. Pain, once named, became something she could carry without being owned by it. She began to trust herself again. Not in the naive sense of believing the world could not hurt her, but in the deeper sense of knowing she could exist within it without disappearing. She allowed herself to be seen without performing vulnerability, to occupy space without apology, to build a life that did not need to be defended by someone else's power in order to be legitimate. This was not healing as redemption. It was healing as sovereignty. He, meanwhile, remained within the architecture he had helped create, but it no longer belonged to him in the way it once had. Influence did not vanish overnight. Systems did not release their architects simply because they had lost faith in them. But his relationship to that world changed in ways that were not immediately visible from the outside. He began to withdraw from the mechanisms that had once defined him. Not in dramatic acts of renunciation, but in a series of deliberate refusals. He stopped intervening where intervention was not necessary. He stepped back from decisions that had once demanded his control. He allowed processes to unfold without bending them toward outcomes that served only the preservation of his authority. This did not dismantle the structure, but it altered his place within it. Power, for the first time in his life, became something he could set down. He experienced what remained when he no longer defined himself by his capacity to shape the world through force, strategy, or inevitability. What remained was not weakness. It was unfamiliarity, a silence that had nothing to do with absence and everything to do with internal alignment. He discovered that the constant vigilance he had once mistaken for purpose had been a form of captivity. He did not become someone else. He became someone unoccupied. The loss of her did not fade. But it changed. It no longer registered as a wound that demanded closure. It became a point of reference, the moment in which he had been forced to confront the limits of his own logic, the moment in which love had not asked him to protect, to dominate, or to possess, but to release. That choice had not diminished him. It had redefined him. He began to live in a way that no longer required constant expansion of control. Not because he had renounced responsibility, but because he had learned the difference between responsibility and ownership. He allowed himself to exist without the perpetual necessity of command. He built a life that did not depend on invisibility for its stability. He accepted a narrower world, but one that belonged to him rather than to the structures he had once embodied. Their paths did not converge quickly. When they did, it was not through coincidence, and not through longing disguised as fate. It happened because time, in its indifferent patience, had carried them into a space where neither of them needed to be protected from the other's existence. They encountered one another not as past versions of themselves, but as what had been forged in the distance between them. She recognized him not by the authority that had once surrounded him, but by the absence of it. The way he occupied space without claiming it. The way his presence no longer rearranged the environment around him. There was strength in him still, but it was no longer a force directed outward. It had become something internal, something that did not require witnesses. He recognized her not as someone he had once shielded, but as someone who no longer needed to be. The person before him was not defined by survival. There was no tightness in her movements, no calculation behind her attention. She did not approach the world as a series of threats to be managed. She existed within it with a calm that did not demand justification. What passed between them was not relief. It was recognition. They did not return to what they had been. They could not. What had existed between them had been shaped by danger, by imbalance, by the urgency of survival. That structure had been necessary once. It had also been unsustainable. What remained now was not that bond, but something quieter, something that did not depend on fear or protection to justify itself. They did not pretend that time had erased what they had shared. They did not frame their reunion as destiny or correction. They acknowledged what had been without trying to resurrect it. The connection between them was no longer forged in crisis. It was built in clarity. They chose one another not as refuge, not as rebellion against the world that had shaped them, but as two individuals who had already faced their own darkness and learned to exist beyond it. Their closeness no longer carried the weight of transgression. It was not hidden. It was not dangerous by necessity. It was deliberate. She did not belong to his world. He did not become her shield. They did not construct a life in opposition to power or violence, nor did they retreat from it in illusion. They acknowledged the world as it was, without pretending that love could transform it into something gentler. What love offered instead was not escape. It offered presence. They built something that did not require secrecy to survive. Not because the world had become kinder, but because they had become honest. The warmth between them did not resemble the heat of desperation that had once defined their connection. It did not burn with urgency or fear of loss. It existed as something sustained, something that did not need to be proven through sacrifice. It was not the warmth of rescue. It was the warmth of recognition. They did not erase what they had endured. They carried it with them, not as a burden but as knowledge. She remained someone who had survived a system that had tried to erase her. He remained someone who had once embodied a structure that required control in order to function. Neither of those truths disappeared. But neither of them remained captive to those identities. Their love did not promise safety. It did not offer resolution. It did not pretend to be a victory over fear, violence, or power. It existed within a world that still contained all of those forces. What it offered instead was the refusal to belong entirely to them. They chose to be together not because the world had changed, but because they had. They understood that closeness was not harmless. They understood that love carried risk. They understood that intimacy, in a world structured by domination and vulnerability, was never neutral. They accepted that, not with illusion, with consent. Their story did not resolve into simplicity. It did not conclude with certainty. It ended in something quieter and far more difficult. The understanding that love does not correct the world. It does not absolve history. It does not erase cost. What it can do is carve out a space within that world where two people choose one another without surrendering themselves. Where closeness does not require ownership. Where protection does not require domination. Where warmth remains, even when the world beyond it stays cold. That was what they found. Not a fairy tale. Not a redemption. But a place where they could stand together without becoming smaller. A place where love did not belong to power. A place where what had been broken did not disappear, but no longer defined what could still be built. That was where the warmth remained. Story written and directed for Dark Hearts Collection. Thank you for being part of this silence between storms. More stories soon.